I hope you're doing well this evening. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 2. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 2 this evening, and I'm going to take the prayer concerns as soon as I can find something to write on here. And so I want to started. I'm guessing you take it as a good sign that they didn't tar and feather me at my home church this morning, or didn't stone me on the way out the door. But I preached this morning at. It's kind of funny how the Lord works this stuff out. I was preaching at my home church, 3 miles in that direction. Actually, that direction this morning, and I had planned to preach on the prodigal son and coming home, and it being homecoming. And they still do a parking lot service, for folks that will drive in, sit, and the preacher preaches the message. And he forgot to tell me that I needed to preach that service. And so when I showed up after the service had ended, he was rolling up the banner that has the radio frequency that you turn it to. And he told me after church, or before church, he said, I completely forgot to tell you about that. He said, I didn't think about it till this morning, so I didn't call you, but he said, I just went ahead and preached a message on the prodigal son. And I said, that parking lot service was supposed to get that message one way or another. And so it worked out good. And to the benefit of your grandkids, I did preach this morning, opening with an illustration of the prodigal cow that we had at our farm this past week. So, but anyway, so this evening we are in Exodus chapter 2, and so I would encourage you, as always, to continue reading the chapter that we have ahead of us. So like next Sunday night, we're having our ice cream fellowship time The next Sunday is homecoming, and so, or not homecoming, is Father's Day, and then the next Sunday on the 22nd, we will be in Exodus chapter 3. So my encouragement would be to read Exodus chapter 3 as part of your daily Bible reading between now and that Sunday. But last time that we were together, we looked at the events of everything from the death of Joseph at the end of the book of Genesis to the birth of Moses in what we're in the text that we're looking at tonight. And so tonight we're going to look at basically 40 years of Moses' life. Exodus chapter 2 covers basically 40 years in the life of Moses, from his birth to his self-imposed exile in Midian. And so just to sort of keep us on the biblical timeline, the birth of Moses occurred around 1526 BC. And Moses left Egypt on the run, going to Midian, in about 1486 BC. So this sort of gives us an idea of when this would happen. And again, when we did our timeline of the Bible and we looked at that, I told you these some of these dates are questionable. Sometimes they're fixed. There are some who think that this is an earlier date for the exile, and that it was a much later time, as in like the 1300s BC or 1200s BC, that Moses and the exile happened. But that couldn't have happened because of other biblical references that we find. It just doesn't make sense that would be the case. And so, nevertheless, we're going off of this time frame based on what we read in other parts of the scriptures, in Chronicles referencing, or in Kings referencing Solomon and his kingship. So tonight we're going to start off looking at verses 1 through 10, and what we're going to look at first is Moses' birth and his adoption. So let's look at Exodus 2, verses 1 through 10. I'm reading from the CSB this evening. It says, "Now a man from the family of Levi married a Levite woman. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with asphalt and pitch. She placed the child in it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Then his sister stood at a distance in order to see what would happen to him. Pharaoh's daughter went down to bathe at the Nile, where her servant girls walked along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds, sent her slave girl, took it, opened it, and saw him, the child, and there he was, a little boy, crying. She felt sorry for him and said, 'This is one of the Hebrew boys.' Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Should I go and call a Hebrew woman who is nursing to nurse the boy for you?' 'Go,' Pharaoh's daughter told her. So the girl went and called the boy's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay your wages.' So the woman took the boy and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, 'I drew him out of the water.'" So as we know that Moses is the author of Genesis, Exodus, all the way through Deuteronomy. But something caught my eye as I was reading tonight, and I almost stopped and mentioned it. But you can tell that Moses is the author of this by some of the things that he says, and it's attributed to him by Jesus and other people in the New Testament. But in verse 2, I love the way he puts that. When she saw that he was beautiful, so Moses is saying, "I was a pretty baby. I was a beautiful baby," and he doesn't hold back on that. It's kind of funny that he says that. But nevertheless, we read in 1 Chronicles chapter 6. If you were to look at 1 Chronicles 6, don't turn there. What we find there is Jacob's son Levi. We find a genealogy for the family of Levi. And we find that Levi had a son named Kohath. And Kohath had a son named Amram, and then Amram had 2 children named Miriam and Aaron. And then Exodus chapter 2 tells us a little bit about this family and what's going on. And really what it does is it tells us the origin story of Moses, and him being the younger sibling to Miriam and Aaron. Now, when Jochebed, which was Moses' mother, when she gave birth to him, it was during the time when Pharaoh had made the order that all males born to the Hebrews were to be killed. And so Jochebed did all she could by hiding Moses for 3 months. I mean, you can imagine, even at 3 months old, a baby isn't an infant is not all that noticeable. But the older he's getting, the more volume there is in his cries. There's more activity. It's harder to, put him to sleep and hide him when, somebody comes by or anything like that. But at about 3 months old, she just wasn't able to hide him any longer. And so she had to decide what she was going to do. Was she going to try and keep him in the hopes that nobody would notice him, knowing that probably wouldn't happen? Or would she, entrust him to God, so to speak? And so what she did was she took a basket and she covered it with tar. This is the kind of tar. I did a little reading this week on this to sort of figure out what was the difference between asphalt and pitch, or tar and pitch, as they depending on your translation. And these are two different and distinct things. The tar is more like what bubbles up out of the ground, that kind of a tar. We think about the La Brea tar pits and things like that. But then she put that on one side of it, and then she put pitch on the other side, which is more flexible in the sunlight, is something that I read. And so she did all of that to basically waterproof the basket, because she was going to put him she was going to put him along the edge of the river, and that was going to, it was going to matter that the water didn't come in and drown him, or that, he would stay dry and not get sick, because she didn't know how long he was going to be in the basket. And it tells us that she put Moses in the basket and placed it, as it says, among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Now, you need to notice that she didn't place him in the river and float him down the Nile, as we sometimes think. It's sort of the mindset that we have. She put him in the Nile River. Well, if you put something in the river that's made to float, it's going to float down the river, right? The current is going to pull it down the river. But it says specifically that she put him among the reeds, meaning that he was in, it's kind of the swampy, not necessarily swampy area, but the place where the reeds were along the water's edge, so he wouldn't float down. And so that was obviously very purposeful. But she did that very strategically, yet it was still very dangerous, because there are crocodiles and other animals that could have caused damage or injured Moses. But not only that, it was dangerous for him to be left alone as a Hebrew boy of that age, because there was no one to protect him if a soldier found him, or an Egyptian with less than honorable intentions like Pharaoh's daughter had. But she was wise in where she put him, because she put him close to the area right there where Pharaoh's daughter would bathe. And so not only that, his older sister just sort of played watchman for him, and just sort of kept an eye on him to see what would happen to him, and what would go on. And we can be sure that as he grew older, and during their time during the Exodus, I'm sure that Miriam and Aaron both recounted for him what had gone on, so that it was something that he knew by heart. I'm sure that we all have those stories from when we were growing up that either people told us happened when we were little, and we may not remember it, or things that were impactful on us. My brother still to this day likes to remind me when we were 2 and 6 that I hit him in the head with a claw hammer at my grandparents' house. And I told him, I've been telling you for years to leave me alone. But it's one of those things. I don't remember that, but I've been told about it, and it's one of those stories. My brother likes to remind me of it. But I'm sure that was the case with Moses and Miriam and Aaron. But nevertheless, what we find is that Pharaoh's daughter, possibly Hatshepsut, Shepsut, the daughter of Thutmose I, was the Pharaoh's daughter who was there along the water. She went to go bathe at the river, and she saw the basket. And after her servant retrieved it and she found Moses there, she immediately knew that she didn't question whether it was an Egyptian or whether it was a Hebrew. She knew immediately that this has to be one of the Hebrew boys that have been being slaughtered across the Egyptian kingdom. And so she was trying to figure out what to do there. And so Miriam speaks up and basically asked if Pharaoh's daughter wanted her to go find a good Hebrew nursemaid for her. Of course, she agreed to do that, and that's what happened. Was she wanted someone to nurse the child until he could be weaned and maybe even a little older, and then bring him back to Pharaoh's daughter. And so Pharaoh's daughter agreed, and Miriam brought none other than Moses' own mother. Brought her, and Jochebed and Pharaoh's daughter talked, and she agreed to not only nurse Moses, but Pharaoh's daughter agreed to actually pay her to nurse her own son. To tell I'm going to pay you to babysit your own kid. That's basically what goes on here. And so Moses was, if you think about it, Moses was not even out of his family's care, out of his own home, even a day. He's placed in the river. Pharaoh's daughter finds it, and then turns around and sends him right back home. And so, he stayed there, other than that one day in the water, or, a couple hours in the water. He stayed at home until he went to the palace to be with Pharaoh's daughter. Some, you can read in commentaries, and there's different viewpoints and thoughts on how long Moses was at home with his family until he went to the palace. There are some that say he was as young as 2 to 3 years old when he was returned to Pharaoh's daughter, and some will say that he was as late as 12 years old. That he was at least that old before he went back to the palace. I tend to think that from other things you read about weaning of children in the patriarchal time period and even the time of the Exodus, that probably 3 to 5 years. He would have probably been weaned around 3 to 4 years old, maybe 3, and maybe kept until 5. Not to say he couldn't have been kept till 12, but we just don't know for certain. That's just one. He was older. That could have been 10 days and he'd have been older. But it was probably somewhere between 3 to 12 years old at most. But when he was old enough, he rejoined Pharaoh's daughter, and she named him Moses, which means I drew him out of the water. And so we don't know if he went by a different name up until that point that he went to live in the palace, or if that's what she said she was going to name him, and that's the name he was given from birth or whatever, or from the time she found him at 3 months old. We just don't know. But we find that that's what happens. He goes back and he ends up in the palace with Pharaoh's daughter. So look at verses 11 through 14, where we see that Moses commits murder. It says, beginning in verse 11, years later, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his own people and observed their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his people. Looking all around and seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian dead and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you attacking your neighbor? Who made you a commander and judge over us?" The man replied, "Are you planning to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses became afraid and thought, "What I did is certainly known." So from this time, growing up in his parents' home, Moses would have learned about his Hebrew heritage. They're taught, in this time, Jewish boys or Hebrew boys are taught, or Hebrew kids are taught the scriptures as far as from memory. They hear it on a regular basis. They're taught what is now the Torah, but they would have been taught family stories and learning about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all of these things. He would have learned many of these things, and he learned about his Hebrew heritage. But not just that, his adoptive mother, Pharaoh's daughter, would not have, or doesn't appear to have tried to keep that from him either. So he would have known that there was something different about him, something else that probably would set him apart from the Egyptians, that would have helped him to know that there was something different about him, was that because this was post-Abraham, Moses would have been circumcised at 8 days old, if I get my numbers right, 8 days old, and that would have probably set him apart from the Egyptians, because that was circumcision was something that the Jews did distinctively amongst themselves. It was also something that was sometimes done in the land of Canaan in different people groups, but it wasn't like a widespread thing that every people group in the Middle Eastern area did. And so the Egyptians may not have done that. So he would have been distinctly different in that way as well. But what we know is that as Moses grew up, he would have watched as his adopted family and his adopted country of Egypt brutally enslaved his biological family, his extended family. But at the age of 12, maybe 13, but most likely 12, Moses would have begun military training. Being in the home of Pharaoh, that's when they would have started that with him. And not only would he have been trained in military matters, tactics and, how to attack and how to use weapons and all that sort of stuff, but he would have also been taught civil matters. He would have been trained in civil matters as well that any potential ruler would need. And so we don't know if Pharaoh's daughter had any other children. We don't know if this particular Pharaoh's daughter was the only child. We don't know that. But things could have obviously have worked out potentially for Moses to have maybe even been the next Pharaoh had, she not had any siblings and she had no other children. He could have been third in line for the kingdom of Egypt at this time, and he would need to be trained. He would need to know the art of war. He would need to know how to deal with civil matters civic matters throughout Egypt. And so Moses is growing up. He learns these things, and he's trained. He's given all the benefits of the entirety of Egypt based on living in Pharaoh's house, and he does that for the next 28 years. And around the age of 40, what he did was he went out to check on the Hebrews. He was looking at, seeing the Hebrews and see how they were being treated. And, we have to remember that at this point in time, it wasn't as if the Hebrews had just been enslaved all of a sudden. By the time Moses is going out to check on them, as we read here in the text, the Hebrews had been enslaved for somewhere around 50 to 100 years. We don't really know exactly because we don't have definitive information on that, but they had been enslaved all of Moses' life and probably all of his parents' life. And so, nevertheless, the way that the Hebrews were being treated when Moses came on the scene to find them that day was commonplace. The things that they were seeing was not all of a sudden, he was just, things had took a turn for the worse and Moses got mad about it. That wasn't the case. But Moses, as we read, he saw an Egyptian that was beating a Hebrew, and it's kind of interesting. This again shows us the firsthand account of Moses in Exodus right here, when he says that Moses looked around and noticed that there was nobody watching, and he killed the Egyptian, and it even gives us the detail, rather than the fact that he just killed the Egyptian, he killed him and hid him in the sand. Moses is trying to, hide the evidence of what he's done. But the details that we see there, help us to see that he was an eyewitness to these events, that he saw all of this go on as he did it and knew about it. And so, and recorded it when he recorded all of the biblical texts that he's credited with. But Moses thought that the only person who would know what had happened was the person that he rescued, the Hebrew that was being beaten. This is the only one, because he had looked around to see if anybody was watching, and nobody was watching. And so the next day, though, 24 hours later, he was out among the Hebrew slaves, and two of them were fighting, and the one that he calls down the one that was in the wrong, and he tried to break up the fight, and he found out real quick that word was already out about what he had done. And so, obviously, either someone saw him, or the Hebrew slave that he saved was saying, hey, guess what? I was getting beaten to death, and guess who saved me? None other than Pharaoh's grandson, Pharaoh's adopted grandson, the Hebrew that lives in the palace. He's the one that actually saved me. So there's a lot of ways that particular Hebrew slave could have shared that information. But if the Hebrews who were slaves, if the Israelites, the Hebrews, knew about Moses' crime, it wouldn't be long before one of them, looking for preferential treatment, would say something to their guard or taskmaster, who would say something to their supervisor, who would pass it on up the chain, and word would get back to Pharaoh. It's just a matter of time. And not only was it a fact that this would happen, but Moses knew this would happen. He knew that that was where this was headed. He thought by hiding the Egyptian in the sand that maybe he could get away with it, but because there was one other witness to it, there's no way that it was not going to be mentioned. But look at verses 15 through 25 as we finish our look at the actual biblical text for tonight. But we're going to see how Moses was ended up actually in Midian. It says, beginning in verse 15, it says, when Pharaoh heard about this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then some shepherds arrived and drove them away, but Moses came to their rescue and watered their flock. When they returned to their father Reuel, he asked, why have you come back so quickly today? They answered, an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock. So where is he? He asked his daughters. Why then did you leave the man behind? Invite him to eat dinner. Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. She gave birth to a son whom he named Gershom, for he said, I have been a resident alien in a foreign land. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor. They cried out, and their cry for help because of their difficult labor ascended to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the Israelites, and God knew. So when Pharaoh got word of the murder that Moses committed, it says that he tried to kill Moses. We don't know if this was sending soldiers out to actually kill Moses. We don't know if this was an understanding by Moses that that soldiers were sent out to capture him or arrest him and put him in prison for trial, for a trial and then execution, or if he was going to be brought in and executed on the spot. We don't know, but and Moses didn't go into detail, but obviously he knew how this was going to work. So this is one of those things where it would be kind of interesting to know the detail, but Moses just didn't include it. But he was honest about Pharaoh's response. The end result was going to be that because Moses had taken a life, Moses' life was going to be taken. That's, it's just what was going to happen. So Moses fled from Egypt and traveled more than 200 miles to the land of Midian. You see on the screen there, the land of Goshen up here is where the Israelites were, and even the storehouse cities that we mentioned last time, Pithom and Ramses, they're really right about in here, right along the edge of the delta, if I remember right. Thebes down here at the bottom, that was the capital of Egypt during Moses' day. So that is, it's the city of Luxor today, but Thebes, and you see how far down that is from the area where the Israelites were living and doing a lot of their work. But Moses would have left, obviously, because if the Hebrews were working up in this region, he obviously would have had to have left from there. So what that means is that either Pharaoh sent guards from way down here at Thebes up to Goshen, or that means that Pharaoh was in this region to begin with. We just don't know. But what happens is we see that Moses ends up leaving Goshen. He crosses the wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula, which is where Mount Sinai, where the Israelites would wander for part of their wilderness wandering. And he makes his way to Midian. And this is the peninsula of Saudi Arabia, basically, if it was a larger view. And so Midian is in that northwestern corner of Saudi Arabia. And so we don't know how Moses got all the way from here to there as far as what path he took or anything like that. But it's about a 200 to 300 mile journey, depending on if he took trade routes that would have brought him down and around, or if he just trying to get out of town and went straight across. It'd have been a little over 200 miles that way. But we don't even know where Moses, where he ended up finding this family that he would end up becoming a part of. But nevertheless, that shows us the landscape of where he was at during that time. But what he did was, we find that, that area, the wilderness of Sinai, that area that he traveled through was area that he would, in 40 years, walk the Israelites through. And so it would be land that he would not only cross going back to Egypt, but then when he leaves with the Israelites from Egypt, he would cross that land again. So he must have become somewhat familiar with that area and the land and wells and streams and all that sort of stuff. So when Moses made it to Midian, though, he gets there and he sat down at a well. And when he gets there, that's the same well that was used by shepherds in the area to water their flocks and take care of their animals. And the daughters of the priest of Midian came to water their flocks, their father's flocks, on that day that Moses was there. And there were some other shepherds that showed up who tried to run them off and scatter their flocks. And instead, Moses came to their aid and helped them, and even went so far as to water the flocks of the daughters of the priest of Midian. Now, when the daughters return, they go and tell their father. It's interesting that they don't say that it's a Hebrew. They say that it's an Egyptian, had rescued them. And that's kind of interesting. As far away as Egypt was from Midian, how did they know that he was an Egyptian unless he told them that he was an Egyptian? That shows you sort of the interconnectedness of the region and the fact that traders would have probably spoken certain languages and things like that. And he may have even, at that point, even though it would have taken him probably at least 2 weeks, maybe more, to get across the Sinai Peninsula, probably 10 to 12 days at best, he would probably have still been dressed as an Egyptian. So he probably wouldn't have been dressed as a Hebrew at that point. But they invited Moses to come and stay with them, and they offered him to eat with them, and they did. And eventually their father, the father of the daughters, Reuel, and from our time in Bible trivia, what is Reuel's other name that we'll read about later? Jethro. Not just the country name, but it's a biblical name. But Reuel, or Jethro, whichever one you want to call him, gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses as a wife. And they end up having a son named Gershom. And Moses named him basically after his, a description of what his name means, a description of Moses' time in Midian, because Gershom means banishment, or one who was driven out or thrust forth. He was driven out of Egypt, basically, is the idea there. He was banished from Egypt, or he was in a time of banishment in Midian. And so Moses wrote that he gave him this name because I have been a resident alien in a foreign land. Meaning that, I've been banished, and here I am. I'm a resident alien in this foreign land of Midian, but I'm going to name him, banishment, basically. How would you like that to be the kid on the playground and like, hey, banishment, come here. It's sort of, because the names, mean something. And so it's kind of interesting how they did that. But nevertheless, while Moses is in Midian, starting, this whole new life, or starting over in life, I guess you would say, we're told that the Pharaoh who was in charge in charge of Egypt during his day, maybe the adopted grandfather, who was maybe Thutmose the First. We find that the same Pharaoh who sought his life died, and there was no real change in Egypt as far as in relation to the Israelites. They continued to be brutalized in slavery, and they cried out to God. And the redeeming thing for us is that we see that their cries were not going unanswered. That God, or unheard, I guess I should say, God was hearing what was going on with the Israelites. And so that's where we find ourselves at the end of Exodus chapter 2. And as always, we want to look at how this, how this intersects and, impacts our lives. And so each week as we're going through Exodus, we're going to look at, how God spoke through what we see, whether he said something or whether he did something. But today, in today's text, what we see is that God prepared Moses to lead Israel. That's what he was preparing Moses to do. And it's kind of interesting because when we look at the text in Exodus chapter 2, we again do not see God speaking audibly like he will on Mount Sinai, giving the law and giving directions for the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant and things like that. But we do see God preparing Moses to lead Israel, that God is speaking through his actions and what he's doing, basically saying, Moses, I'm preparing you to be a leader. I'm preparing you to be a leader in Israel. And so I want you to think about, I'm going to list these things for us, but I want you to think about what we see in this chapter, that in this entire chapter, that God sovereignly used to prepare Moses for his ministry of leading Israel, okay? So think about it from this aspect of, these are the things that happened in Egypt, or in Moses' life, before he walks back into Egypt, back into Pharaoh's court, that prepared him to lead Israel for 40 years in the wilderness. The first is that we see that God had Jochebed to place Moses in the reeds near Pharaoh's daughter's bathing area. So we see that God is, even orchestrating this for Moses when he's 3 months old, that the one who would find him would be the princess of Egypt. But next, we see that Moses had several years learning about his Hebrew heritage in his family home. So he would have been learning about this, and this is not something that just because he was turned over to the palace that he would have forgotten about, and he may have even continued to try and learn about those things. He would have learned about God. He would have learned about worshiping him. He would have learned about the promises and the covenants that God had made to the people of Israel, including Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But then, next, we know that Moses would have been prepared to be a ruler of a nation of people. And so the military and civil training that Moses received as a young man in Egypt would have prepared him to lead a large nation. Pharaoh intended for him to help lead Egypt in some way. Now, he may have been a minister or, like a cabinet member for Pharaoh, an advisor. That may have been what Pharaoh had in mind for him. But he could have stepped into the role of Pharaoh with all the training that he received. And so Moses would have been taught all of that. He would have been taught about Egyptian religion, which will come into play during the days of the plagues that we'll talk about later in this study. He would have known how to present himself before Pharaoh, how to gain an audience with Pharaoh. He would have known what would challenge Pharaoh and what would discourage Pharaoh. So these things are impactful for the way that he would interact with Pharaoh later in the text. Next, we know that Moses saw the plight of the Israelites in slavery and had a desire to help them. He wasn't callous towards the Israelites. He knew that these were his people, and he felt bad about it and wanted to help. And although he went about it the wrong way the first time, he would eventually help the Israelites be rid of their Egyptian taskmasters once and for all. And so he had a heart for the Hebrew people, but it was a matter of being able to help them and the time that he would be able to do that. Next, Moses' path to Midian took him across the terrain through which he would later lead the Israelites. And what that means is that he would gain knowledge of the area. He would know places in the Sinai Peninsula that would be important, areas such as wells, streams, and grazing lands for their flocks and for their herds. And that would be crucial to the survival of the Israelites in the Sinai wilderness. So it's not like Moses, gets across the parted Red Sea, gets over there and he's like, okay, guys, let's go this way. It's not that he just sort of, points in a direction and decides, hey, this looks like the right way. He would have known where they needed to go and what would have been helpful, even with the leading of God's column of fire by night and the cloud by day. And so he would have been knowledgeable of the area. Next, though, we know that God placed the wise priest of Midian, Reuel, in Moses' path. Later during the Exodus, Reuel or Jethro, whatever you want to call him, he has this opportunity to counsel Moses on how to administer judgments in Israel and not be burnt out. Because Moses is sitting day and night, or all day basically, passing out judgments, and he's the only one that's being brought these issues, and so he's being a judge over Israel, and he's doing this, and it's exhausting him, it's burning him out. And Jethro comes to him and says, "Look, there's a better way to do this. Delegate. Allow somebody over this many and this many and this many to help you administer judgments and justice in Israel." But then lastly, Moses learned in the Midian wilderness there, how to be a shepherd for 40 years. And that's important because leading a large nation is much like shepherding sheep. And Moses acquired the necessary skills on top of his civil and military training from Egypt. He now has the training of being a shepherd for 40 years. And knows how to lead and herd and gather large groups together. So we see that in Moses' life, but for us, it's like, okay, well, how does that apply to us? Because for us, we're 3,500 years after the fact, and we can see that really for us, we can see that God does not waste our time or the path that He has us on. That's what we should take from this. Because God used different events at every turn to prepare Moses for leading Israel to the Promised Land. I mean, everything from 3 months old to 40 years old, and even, some of the stuff he would endure later. So we see that, God uses really ultimately the first 80 years of Moses' life to orchestrate things to help him go in the right direction. But if God is doing that, if He's using those things to do that, God does the same thing for us. He uses those different events at different stages of our life to prepare us for whatever ministry or area of service that He may have for us to volunteer in the church. That's what He has planned for us to do. And so He uses those things in our lives to prepare us to serve in whatever area He's called us to do. He doesn't waste those times when we feel like we're in the desert in Midian, that we're in the wilderness, and God's not using this for anything. I'm just sort of languishing away in this place in my life, but God's not using it. I mean, God's not allowing it to be wasted time. So whether it is, think about it from this way, whether it's a love for children that you're able to use in the nursery, or whether it's years of construction experience where you can help with the Baptist men or maintenance in the church, or whatever it is. There's plenty of opportunities that God uses those times in our life and those things that He has built into us to be able to serve and be used in His church. But the question we have to ask ourselves is whether we are willing to step out in faith and follow God into those uncharted waters of ministry that He has for us. Because sometimes it can be scary stepping out in faith to do the things that God wants us to do. And that's what we see is we'll see in the next chapter how Moses responds to that challenge, the challenge of stepping outside of your comfort zone to go and do what God has designed you to do, what God has prepared you to do, and to trust Him to step out there and to actually do it. And so we'll see that in Exodus chapter 3 in 3 weeks when we are back together for our Sunday night study. So, are there any questions tonight on Exodus chapter 2? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, he would have known who Amram was because of his mother Jochebed. I mean, Amram would have been in the home, and so he would have most likely have known who that was. And especially with him having the connection with Miriam and Aaron, he would have known who that was. But that's a good question, that because it almost sounds like Amram is not even in the picture, but most likely he was. But because Jochebed was the one that made the decision to put him in the basket and then to wean him, chances are Amram did not die between the time Jochebed got pregnant and Moses was 3 months old. That's basically a year. Chances are he probably was still alive at that point. We don't know definitively, but I would say he was probably in the home while Moses was in the home. That's a good question, because it makes it sound like he's not even in the picture. Yeah, so that's a good one. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Right. I've not read that yet in this particular study as to whether Ruel or Jethro was a priest of the Hebrew God, or the God of Abraham, or whether he was a god, as you said, of a heathen nation. I don't know, but it seems like what I've read before was that he was a priest of the Hebrew God, and that would make sense if it was, through Keturah from Abraham and Keturah down. Yeah, I think that's a connection we can make, that is the case. I'll look it up and see as we get closer to talking more about Jethro or Ruel and him being a priest. One of the times when we get a better look at him, I'll definitely have an answer on that. But I'm 55-45 that I'm pretty sure I've read before that he was a priest of the Hebrew God, a priest of the God of Abraham, which would make sense. So, did somebody else have a question? Yes. If you couldn't hear Patsy, her question was, how did Pharaoh's daughter, how did the princess get away with bringing a Hebrew into the palace if they're supposed to be killing all the Hebrew males? Um, have you ever heard of a daddy's girl? Um, that's going to be my first go-to, although that's not biblical. That's, obviously God orchestrated it to where Moses was going to be in the position to learn the things that he needed to learn to lead. So obviously God gave grace and mercy to Moses through Pharaoh at this time in that way and everything. We really don't know, because it is very odd that Pharaoh has said, wipe out all the boys, and here comes one of the boys into his own house. It may have been, this is just completely off of the cuff, and I'll try to find an answer, but I don't know that we obviously won't get a definitive answer. I'll see if I can find something. But one thing that it may be is that this may have been another way of Pharaoh having the opportunity to commit the genocide against the Hebrew people that he was hoping for. Not that he was going to kill Moses, but that Moses wouldn't marry a Hebrew, he'd marry an Egyptian, and she would be, the family line would not continue eventually through the Hebrews, because those kids the biology of the Hebrews would be diluted in even then. And so that may be part of it, that he didn't care about it, because he knew that whoever was in his house was going to marry an Egyptian, and that was going to be it, and it wasn't a big deal. He would be raised as an Egyptian. Moses was raised as an Egyptian. So for him, he would deny all of his Hebrew, history and heritage and all that sort of stuff. Who he's going to marry is going to be an Egyptian, so his kids are going to be raised as Egyptians. So religiously and from an ethnicity standpoint, they're thinking, Pharaoh's thought may have been, they're all going to be Egyptians. I'm not worried about it. But, that daughter of his may have had, daddy wrapped right there and said, look what I found. It's not a puppy, but can I keep it? And, that may very well have been the case. But I don't know. I've not read anything as to that, but there might be some speculation. I'll see if I can find anything on that. But that's interesting. That is something that's always sort of perplexing. Is like, yeah, yeah. And it does show you that he didn't consider Moses to be his biological grandson. He obviously would have known that he was a Hebrew, because more than likely had the interaction with the Egyptian where he was killed by Moses. Had that happened with his own son, there probably would have been, or his own biological grandson, there probably would have been some preferential treatment to him. He probably got off with a scolding and a slap on the wrist and don't do it again type thing. But since Moses was one of the Hebrews and he killed an Egyptian, now it's like we're going to make an example of him, and we're going. He didn't hold back, even though this was his adopted grandson of probably minimum 30 to 35 years. So Moses would have been or Pharaoh would have been familiar with Moses, and so that says a lot about how quickly he was willing to just forego the familial bonds that he had with him and say, oh, well, you're one of those rotten Hebrews. I knew you should have been killed when you were an infant. That I'm sure there were thoughts and comments along those lines. Any other questions? Those are some good questions tonight. That's something we're not. If you didn't hear Elaine, her question was why. When Moses goes back, obviously the Pharaoh that's in charge of Egypt would have been most likely in the line of the Pharaoh that wanted to kill Moses. Well, why didn't they just kill him when he walked in? And that's something I've thought about in the past. But one of the things, and I don't know, I'll have to look and see. I'll have to see if I can maybe try and find an answer there. But one of the things that I learned when we were getting ready for the introduction on Exodus and the first chapter there was that Egyptian history is notoriously unreliable on who succeeded who and who came next and all that sort of stuff. So there may have been, and this is a theory that I'm just throwing out there off the cuff, is that there may have been a complete dynasty change in Egypt. Not necessarily dynasty, but ruling family change, that the Pharaoh who Moses deals with during the Exodus, who obviously is much younger than Moses because he has a child at home that dies during the final plague. If I ruined it for you, I'm sorry. But, he's much younger than Moses because he has a young child at home. So obviously there is a disconnect there, either this is the great-grandson of that, Pharaoh that he dealt with originally, or it could be that this Pharaoh is from a whole new family line, and he's the second one to come from that line. And it's hard telling. But you got to think too. There's 40 years of time passes between Moses killing the Egyptian and Moses walks back into Pharaoh's court. And so, if there's not some of the old guard, if there's not some in the court of this new Pharaoh, which if there was a change in the Pharaohs, altogether, there's probably a really good likelihood that nobody knew who Moses was, that Moses coming, and that may be the case. That would obviously have to be, or they would have just said, off with his head, so to speak, in that moment. But I think that it's probably that there was enough turnover in the court staff, in the lives of the pharaohs, that this person wouldn't have even been thought of when Moses left to go. So this Pharaoh was probably not even born by that time. So it's probably just a matter of nobody knew who Moses was in Pharaoh's house anymore. And so that's, I would think. But I'll try and find that as we get closer to that part of the study. Any other questions? Great questions tonight. All right. Well, if there's not any more, thank you for being here this evening. I want to encourage you to be back on Wednesday night. We'll be back in our study of 1 Timothy, and so hope that you'll be here for that study on Wednesday night. Thursday, our kids are going to the to Linville Caverns, so be sure if you've got a kid or a grandkid that's going to be here for that, make sure they're here at 8:45 on Thursday, and then next Sunday, Sunday morning, we'll be back in our series on the hard saying, or still in our series on the hard sayings of Jesus. And so we'll have that. And then next Sunday night, this will be one of a handful of fellowship Sunday nights that we're going to have. We're going to have an ice cream fellowship. And so we've got a sign-up sheet in the lobby that you can sign up to bring things. One thing that was asked was, if it says ice cream and you sign up for ice cream, can you go to the grocery store and buy a gallon, or do you have to bring homemade? It does not have to be homemade. It's better if it's homemade, but if you don't make homemade ice cream, you can't bring it. And so Pastor Nick is one of those. I would have to go to the store and buy it, so that is okay. So bring sign up to come be a part of that on Sunday night next week, and we'll do that. And so, again, thank you for being here tonight, and we'll round out with a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Father, we come to you tonight just grateful that you show us that all of the difficulties, all of the things that you bring into our life, good or bad, are used by you to prepare us for what you have planned for us. And so, Father, help us to use those things not as burdens or scars, but to use those for you in ministry in the church, and to volunteer and to care for your church. And so, Father, I pray that we would go forward from here, allowing the word that we've looked at tonight to challenge us and move us in our walk with you. And so, Father, I pray that you would just bless us until we're able to come together again on Wednesday night. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.